I ask you to consent that the quorum call-in process be initiated.
Without objection.
As unanimous consent, that I be recognized as in morning business for what time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Last Wednesday, came to the floor and talked about the President's global warming speech that he had made a couple weeks ago, and all that the White House is doing to help frame the debate with his Talking Points memo. And you remember the Talking Points memo is the memo that he used to get people to talk about, to respond to his speech, what to say and what not to say. We happened to intercept that, and it was very, very interesting. And also, they had the secret meetings that took place with some of the alarmist senators on the floor. That's it, so that we are communicating properly, Madam President. The term over the past 12 years of those individuals who say the world's coming to an end, global warming and all of that, they're the ones who are the alarmists. And so they are now trying to revive this thing that has been pretty much resolved over a long period of time. The first thing that the President doesn't want to talk about when you talk about global warming, now they changed the name because one is not as acceptable, so they try climate change, then they try, what's the most recent one they're using? Carbon pollution. You know, in one of these days they'll find something that sells. So far it hasn't. But the first thing they don't want to talk about is cost. And this is the reason. We have had several bills that are the global warming cap and trade bills over the past 12 years. Actually, when the first bills came out, the Republicans were a majority, so I was the chairman of the committee called Environment and Public Works, and I was the one who had the responsibility of defeating them, and we did. And the reason was that in the very beginning, back in the Kyoto Treaty, we're talking about 12 years ago, everyone believed that all this was taking place. You remember, that was when Al Gore came back from Rio de Janeiro and convinced everyone that it was. Well, a lot of people thought this was the case until it was a group out of the Wharton School that did a study. And they said, now, if we pass cap and trade, and I think they're using, I'm going from memory now, that they would regulate emissions from organizations that emitted 25,000 tons or more of CO2 a year. If we did that, the cost would be between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, one of the things I do as a conservative is every time we hear these figures, I get the most recent information that I can from my state of Oklahoma in terms of the number of people that are there that are filing federal tax returns, and I do the math. And now what that meant, Madam President, at that time, it would cost, and this is the way it works out, each one about $3,000 a year. Now, that's if we had cap and trade. Now, this kind of kept going throughout the years. The most recent one was authored by Senator Markey, who up until yesterday was Congressman Markey. He's now officing next to me. He's one that I have a great deal of respect for. But he had the last bill that was a cap and trade bill. And again, I'm going from memory. It was around regulating those with emissions of 25,000 tons a year or more. Now, the cost of the thing is really never been debated that much because it came out later on that the Charles Rivers Association came out and said it'd be between $300 and $400 billion a year. MIT came out and said it'd be about that much. So we know the cost is there. But under the President's plan, it would be far more. No one's actually calculated this yet, to my knowledge, because if the President tries to do this, now keep in mind he's trying to pass by regulation a cap and trade policy for America. that he was not able to pass through legislation, so we're doing it through regulation. Well, if you do it through regulation, it has to be under the Clean Air policy, the Clean Air Act. Now, the Clean Air Act requires us to regulate any source that put the emissions under that on over 250 tons. So instead of 25,000 tons being regulated, it'd be those 250 tons. That would be, you know, every hospital, every apartment building, every school, every oil and gas well, every farm. And those are the ones who would actually come under this thing. It's just a massive regulation. And no one knows exactly what it would cost the economy, but it would be staggering because we know that to pull this off, the EPA alone would have to spend $21 billion and hire an additional 23,000 bureaucrats to do this. Now, that's not my figures. That's their figures. So you have to stop and think that cap-and-trade bills cost $400 billion at the level of regulating the emitters of 25,000 tons a year or more, and just imagine what it would be when you drop it down to 250 tons. So now the second thing that the President doesn't want to talk about is the fact that it is a unilateral effort. If you pass a regulation in the United States of America, it's going to only affect the United States of America. And I've always had a lot of respect for Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson was the administrator of the EPA under the Obama administration. While she's liberal and I'm conservative, she was always honest in her answers. And I asked her the question, I said, you know, if we pass, either by legislation or any other way, cap and trade in the United States, is that going to reduce worldwide CO2 emissions? And her answer was no. Because if you do that, you're doing it just us, on the brightest sectors of our economy, without China, without Mexico, without India and the rest of the world doing it. Then U.S. manufacturers could have the reverse effect because they could end up having to go to other countries where there are not restrictions on emissions, and so they would actually be emitting more. This is the problem that we have. There go our jobs overseas seeking energy in areas where they're able to afford it. And using her, Lisa Jackson's quote exactly, she said, when I asked her the question on the record, she said, I believe that the U.S. action alone will not impact CO2 levels. So here's what we've got. It's a combination of two things, and this is what the President doesn't want to talk about in his lust for over-regulation in this country. One is the fact that it's going to cost a lot of money. It would be the largest tax increase in the history of America, without question. And the second thing is, even if you do it, it doesn't lower emissions. So this is the problem that you have. Now, a lot of people say, well, then why do they want to do it? Well, you know I know I lose a lot of people when I make this statement, but there are a lot of liberals who really believe that government should control our lives more. I had this observation back when I was first elected and I was in the House. And one of the things that I saw that were differences between liberals and conservatives is that the liberals have a basic philosophy that government can run our lives better than people can. And so when you stop and you look at one of the most outstanding, recognized scientists in this country, is a guy named Dr. Richard Lindzen. He's with MIT. He's considered to be a great source, maybe the greatest source in terms of scientific knowledge. And he said that regulating carbon is a bureaucrat's dream, because if you regulate carbon, you regulate life. If you control carbon, you control life. Now, tomorrow the EPA, Environment Public Works Committee, is going to conduct a hearing on climate change, whatever they call it. I think they're starting out with global warming. They may call it something else. Maybe, what's the third thing they're calling it?
Carbon pollution.
Carbon. Thank you, Luke. You're nice to have here. Carbon pollution. That's the new word, because that is more sellable. You know, a lot of stuff around here is done with wordsmithing. I mean, we do it. Republicans and Democrats both do it. And that's the one, since global warming didn't work and climate change didn't work, now it's CO2. What is it?
Carbon pollution.
Carbon pollution, yeah. So anyway, they're going to have a hearing. And the chairman of the committee, Barbara Boxer, is going to have a lot of the people come in and talk about the world coming to an end. However, the interesting thing here is that the administration is sending all just the alarmists to talk about how bad global warming is and how we're all going to die, but they're not taking the process seriously enough to send any real official. We have no government officials that are on as witnesses. This is highly unusual. This doesn't happen very often, but that's what we're going to be having. It's important for members to understand that these greenhouse gas regulations are not the only EPA regulations that threaten our economy. Again, all the regulations on government getting involved in our lives. If you look at this chart, this is a chart. These are the ones that are the ones that they are actually working on right now in the Environment and Public Works Committee or the Environmental Protection Agency. Utility MAC. Utility MAC was something they passed. That's done. But MAC, by the way, Madam President, means Maximum Achievable Control Technology. And so it says, where is our technology right now? How much of this can we control? The problems we're having is they're putting the emissions requirements at a level that is below where we have a technology to make it happen. So utility MAC, that'd be the cost. These figures, by the way, are not refuted figures. That would cost $100 billion. It cost 1.65 million jobs. That's in the law already. You have a lot of coal plants that are being shut down right now. But wait a minute. You might ask, how can they do that when right now we're reliant upon coal for 50% of the power it takes to run this machine called America? The next one, boiler MAC. That's now boiler MAC. That's again maximum achievable control technology. Boiler MAC. Every manufacturer has a boiler, so this controls all manufacturers, and that is estimated to be $63.3 billion and 800,000 jobs. The NAAQS legislation would put a lot of countries out of attainment. I was mayor of the city of Tulsa back when we were out of attainment. Tulsa, the city, is located in Tulsa County. In Tulsa County, when we were out of attainment, we were not able to do a lot of the things that we were, that we're supposed to do in order to try to recruit industry. And this right here would put 2,800 counties out of attainment, including all 77 counties in my state of Oklahoma. And if that causes emissions to increase, then the company would be required to find an offset for those new emissions. We're kind of in the weeds here, but the simple outcome is that no new businesses would be able to come to an out-of-attainment area, and existing businesses wouldn't be allowed to expand. The President is also issuing a new Tier 3 standard that applies to refineries as they manufacture gasoline. This rule will cause gasoline to rise by 9 cents a gallon. The EPA is also working tirelessly to tie groundwater contamination to hydraulic fracturing, a process that so that they and the federal government can regulate this. You know, they tried that in Wyoming in the Pavilion case. They tried it in Pennsylvania in the Demick case, and in Texas several times they have made that effort. I know something about that, Madam President, because in the state of Oklahoma, hydraulic fracturing started there in 1949. 1949, there's been more than 1 million applications of hydraulic fracturing. That's a way of getting oil and gas out of tight formations. They've tried it over 1 million times, and there's never been a confirmed case of groundwater contamination. But they still want to have this regulated by the federal government. And so the Interior is trying to hard, which would apply to federal lands. This thing, and there isn't time to get into the basic problem here. That is, this President Obama, has had a war on fossil fuels now for longer than he's been President of the United States. And of course, the key is this: if they can stop hydraulic fracturing and regulate that at the federal level, then they can stop all this boom that is going on right now in the country. I mean, we've had a 40% increase in the last 4 years of our production of oil and gas, but the interesting thing is that's all on private land and on state land. It has not, we've actually had a reduction in our production on federal land. So that is a problem that we're having there that is very serious. The EPA also wants to develop a guidance document for waters of the United States. Now, the Clean Water Restoration Act is one that was introduced it 2 years ago, and they tried to get it passed. The Senate author was Senator Feingold from Wisconsin, and the House author was Congressman Oberstar. Not only did we defeat the Clean Water Restoration Act, they were both defeated in their next election. So we have that effort. Again, this is something the President's trying to do. They were not able to do it through regulations. And what it means is this. We have rules saying that the federal government's in charge of water runoff in this country only to the extent that it is navigable. That's the word that's written into the law. I think we all understand that. You take the navigable out, then every little, in my arid state of Oklahoma, if you have standing water after a rain, that would be regulated by the federal government. Now, that's a major problem that our farmers have, not just the Oklahoma Farm Bureau, but farm bureaus throughout America, saying that the Water Restoration Act and the cap and trade are the two major issues that they are concerned with. Now, there's a lot of what the EPA has done that has done this through enforcement. I was very proud of some of this has been about a year ago, I think, Luke, that we had we had one of our staff person discovered that a guy named Al Armendariz, you might remember him, he was a regional EPA administrator. He said, and he was talking to a bunch of people in Texas, he's a regional administrator for the EPA, and he says, what we've got to do is we need to crucify the oil and gas industry. And he said, just like the Romans, when they go through Turkey and they would crucify the first 5 people that they would see, and that would get the attention and get them to be their subordinates. And this is a perspective not just of Armendariz, but the entire EPA toward the fossil fuel industry. By the way, Armendariz is no longer there, and he's working with one of the environmental groups now, and I'm sure he's a lot happier there. The EPA is also dramatically expanding a number of permits the oil and gas industry is required to obtain under the Clean Air Act by counting multiple well sites as though they were one site, even though they may be spread out in as many as 42 square miles. All of this is so they can regulate more of what goes on at the wells, and it underscores how adversarial they are to us having the fuel we need to run this country. The EPA was eventually sued and lost the case over this issue of what they are doing right now throughout America to try to force all of the multiple well sites into one site, as they did. Well, they lost it in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. But every place outside of the Sixth Circuit, the EPA is still using their old regulation. This is one that we've been talking to them about. The EPA is also targeting the ag community. I've already talked about what their top concerns are, but in addition to that, the EPA recently released a private sensitive data of pork producers and their concentrated animal feeding operation, that's CAFO, C-A-F-O, to environmental groups. The environmental groups hate the CAFOs, and the EPA knows this, so by doing this, the EPA has enabled the environmental groups to target CAFOs and put them out of business. That's our farmers. The farmers seem to be, it seems to me, when you look at people coming into my office, and they talk about the abuses of this over-regulation and all these things, it just seems like the ones that keep getting hit worse and worse are the farmers. I can remember when they tried to treat propane as a hazardous waste, and we had a hearing. This was some years ago, and I was, at that time, the chairman of the Environment Public Works Committee, and I can remember when they said, well, this only cost the average farmer in Oklahoma another $600 or $700 a year. Well, we went through this thing, and we were able to defeat that. So farmers have been hit hard, but they're not alone. All these regulations have devastating to the entire economy, and they're preventing us from achieving our economic recovery. The President is engaged in an all-out war on fossil fuels, and he's intent on completing this until his assault on the free enterprise system is completed. The business community knows how bad the regulations are. They've been fighting them both tooth and nail since the beginning of Obama's first term. Now, this chart shows the rules that were approved during the President's first term. This is what he did. If you look at them, it takes some time, and these will be printed in the record. So you need to be looking them up and realizing how serious it is. The greenhouse gas, we talked about that. The EPA on the diesel engines. All of these regulations are costing fortunes. The second chart, now that's the ones that were approved during the President's first administration. The second is more alarming because it shows several of the major rules that the President began developing during his first term but delayed their finalization until after the election. So they waited until after the election knowing that the American people would realize how costly this was, and that would cost it could cost his campaign. Now, he's gaming the system, using his administration to advance the radical agenda, but hiding the truth from American people. And he's doing it with the secret talking points and is doing it with the secrecy which shrouds the bad rules. Are these the talking points that we... No.
The rules delayed until...
Yeah, these are the rules that were delayed till after the election, so you can get a good idea of the cost. And we take down the cost of each one, and it is just an incredible amount. The third chart, yes, okay, is the developing his, that's what he's doing right now, but he has no accountability to the electorate because he can do anything he wants to right now. And groups are on record opposing this. We have all of these groups that are on record opposing this thing, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Association of Manufacturers, National Federation, the NFIB, American Railroads, going all the way down to all the ag groups and including a lot of the labor unions. Historically, the labor unions go right along with the Democrats and with the liberals, but they realize now this is a jobs bill, and consequently this is we have the United Mine Workers and others that are being affected by this and are trying to do something about the over-regulation. And all these groups have opposed the rules being put out by the EPA. Even the unions have opposed the rules because they kill all kinds of jobs, union and non-union jobs alike. Cecil Roberts, the president of the United Mine Workers, said that his organization supported my Congressional Review Act. Let me explain what that was. You may have noticed in the first chart we had the first MAC bill that was passed. That would have put coal out of business. So what we have in this body is a rule that nobody uses very often. It hasn't been used very successfully. But it says if a regulator passes something that is not in the best interest of the people, then if you can pass a Congressional Review Act with just 30 co-sponsors, and here in the Senate get a simple majority, you can stop that from going into effect. Well, I had a CRA on that utility MAC, and Cecil Roberts, president of the United Mine Workers, said his organization supported my CRA to overturn the utility MAC rule because the rule poses to Mine Workers Association members lots of jobs. We also had something recently that Jimmy Hoffa came out. So these are jobs, and these are important. Today's national unemployment rate's 7.6, but guess what? In Oklahoma, we're at full employment. In North Dakota, they're at full employment. We have all throughout America. People used to think of the oil belt as being west of the Mississippi. That's not true anymore. With the Marcellus chain going through, you have New York, Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, I understand it's the second largest employer up there. So and if we were able to do throughout America what we do in Oklahoma, we would solve the problem that we have right now. But the Obama rules are there, and Obama wants to pursue more that are even worse. I'm mentioning this. We're going to have a very fine lady, Gina McCarthy, who has been the assistant director of the EPA in charge of air regulations for about 4 years. And while we get along very well, she is one who promotes these regulations. I won't be able to support her nomination. I understand that the votes are all there, and we'll be having a good working relationship. But I just think it's a wake-up call to the American people. They're going to have to realize the cost of this. The total cost of these regulations is well over $600 billion annually, which will cost us as many as 9 million jobs. And the EPA has a reason our nation has not returned to full employment. And all of this is done, I think, intentionally by the Obama administration to cater to their extreme base. I can read that. And right now, the MoveOn.org, the George Soros, the Michael Moore, and that crowd are the ones that are the far left environmentalists, the Hollywood and their friends. And this is going to have to change because of marginal education endeavor. We've got a country to save. And I know that there's a lot of partisan politics going on. In this case, the least known destructive force in our country now is the overregulation, and all of those organizations that oppose it are going to have to pay for it. It's going to be paid for by American dollars and American jobs. With that, I see my good friend from Iowa on the floor, and I yield the floor.
The senator from Iowa.
Take a few minutes to talk about the President's nominee for Secretary of Labor, Tom Perez. I've already spoken on Mr. Perez over the last few weeks, and I will not repeat everything I said, but it's important for my colleagues to understand the basis of my opposition. We've had a lot of debate around here over the last few days about what grounds are appropriate to oppose an executive branch nominee. Many of my colleagues have suggested that senators should not vote against such a nominee based on disagreement over policy. That may or not be the appropriate view, but I'm not going to get into that debate today. I'm quite sure that I would disagree with Mr. Perez on a host of policy issues, but I want to make clear to my colleagues, those policy differences are not the reason I'm vigorously opposed to this nominee. I'm opposed to Mr. Perez because the record he has established to government service demonstrates that he is willing to use the levers of government power to manipulate the law in order to advance a political agenda. Several of my colleagues cited examples of his track record in this regard. But in my view, perhaps the most alarming example of Mr. Perez's willingness to manipulate the rule of law is his involvement in the quid pro quo between the city of St. Paul and the Department of Justice. In this deal, the Department of Justice cut with the city of St. Paul. The department agreed not to join 2 False Claims Act cases in exchange for the city of St. Paul withdrawing its case before the Supreme Court in a case called Magner v. Gallagher. Mr. Perez's actions in this case are extremely troubling for a number of reasons. At this point, no one disputes the fact that Mr. Perez actually orchestrated this entire arrangement. He manipulated the Supreme Court docket so that his favored legal theory, called disparate impact theory, would evade review by this high court. In the process, Mr. Perez left a whistleblower twisting in the wind. Those are the facts, and even Mr. Perez doesn't dispute them. The fact that Mr. Perez struck a deal that potentially squandered up to $200 million taxpayer dollars in order to preserve a disparate impact theory that he favored is, of course, extremely troubling in and of itself. But in addition to that underlying quid pro quo, the evidence uncovered in my investigation revealed Mr. Perez sought to cover up the facts that the exchange ever took place. And finally, let me emphasize that this should concern all of my colleagues when Mr. Perez testified under oath about the case, both to congressional investigators and during confirmation hearings. In those 2 instances, Mr. Perez told a different story. The fact of the matter is that the story Mr. Perez told is simply not supported by the evidence. Let me begin by reviewing briefly the underlying quid pro quo. In the fall of 2011, the Department of Justice was poised to join a False Claims Act lawsuit against the city of St. Paul. That's where the $200 million comes in. That's what was expected to be recovered. The career lawyers in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota were recommending Department of Justice join the case. The career lawyers in the Civil Division of Department of Justice were recommending the Department join the case, and the career lawyers in the Department of Housing and Urban Development were recommending that Justice join the case. So at that point, all of the relevant components of government believed that this case was a very good case. They considered the case on the merits, and they supported moving forward. Or as one of the line attorneys wrote in an email in October 2011, quote, "Look like everyone is on board," end of quote. But of course, this was all before Mr. Perez got involved. Now, at about the same time, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case called Magner v. Gallagher. In Magner, the city of St. Paul was challenging the use of disparate impact theory under the Fair Housing Act. The disparate impact theory is the mechanism Mr. Perez and the Civil Rights Division were using in lawsuits against banks for their lending practices. For instance, during this time period, Mr. Perez and Justice Department were suing Countrywide for its lending practices based upon disparate impact analysis. In fact, in December 2011, the department announced that it had reached a $355 million settlement with Countrywide. And again, in July 2012, Department of Justice announced a $175 million settlement with Wells Fargo, addressing fair lending claims based upon that same disparate impact analysis. And of course, there are a string of additional examples, but I don't need to recite them here. But what is clear is that if that theory were undermined by the Supreme Court, it would likely spell trouble for Mr. Perez's lawsuits against the banks. So Mr. Perez approached the lawyers handling the Magner case, and quite simply, he cut a deal. The Department of Justice agreed not to join two False Claims Act cases in exchange for the city of St. Paul withdrawing Magner from the Supreme Court. Now, you've got interfering in the agenda of the Supreme Court. At the same time, a deal is going to cut the taxpayers out of winning back $200 million under the False Claims Act. In early February 2012, Mr. Perez flew to St. Paul, and he flew there solely to finalize the deal. The next week, Justice Department declined to join the first False Claims Act called the Newell case. The next day, City of St. Paul kept their end of the bargain and withdrew the Magner case from the Supreme Court. Now, there are a couple aspects about this deal that I want to emphasize for my colleagues. First, as I mentioned, the evidence makes clear that Mr. Perez took steps to cover up the fact that he had bartered away the False Claims Act cases and the $200 million. On January the 10th, 2012, Mr. Perez called the line attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding the memo in the Newell case. Newell was the case that these same career attorneys that I referred to and quoted previously were strongly recommending the United States join. Now, all before Mr. Perez got involved. Mr. Perez called the line attorney and instructed him not to discuss the Magner case in the memo that he prepared outlining the reasons for the decisions not to join the case. And here's what Mr. Perez said on that call. Quote, "Hey, Greg, this is Tom Perez calling you at 9 o'clock on Tuesday. I got your message. The main thing I want to ask you, I spoke to some folks in the Civil Division yesterday and wanted to make sure that the declination memo that you sent to the Civil Division, and I'm sure it probably already does this, but it doesn't make any mention of the Magner case. It is just a memo on the merits of the two cases that are under review in the key TAM context, end of quote. So it's pretty clear that they didn't want anything in writing that led people to believe that there was any deal being made. Now, after that telephone message was left, approximately 1 hour later, Mr. Perez sent Mr. Brooker a follow-up email writing, quote, I left a detailed voicemail. Call me if you can after you have a chance to review the voicemail, end of quote. Then several hours later, Mr. Perez sent another follow-up email writing, quote, were you able to listen to my message, question mark, end of quote. Now, Mr. Perez's voicemail was quite clear and obvious. It told Mr. Brooker, quote, make sure that the declination memo doesn't make any mention of the Magner case. It is just a memo on the merits of the two cases, end of quote. So very clear. It couldn't be more clear, in fact, that this was an effort that no paper trail that there was ever any deal made. Yet, when congressional investigators asked Mr. Perez why he left the voicemail, he told an entirely different story. Here's what he told investigators, quote, what I meant to communicate was, it is time to bring this to closure. And if the only issue that is standing in the way is how you talk about Magner, then don't talk about it, end of quote. But anyone who actually listens to the voicemail knows that this is just plainly not what he said in that voicemail. He didn't say anything about being concerned with a delay. He said, quote, make sure you don't mention Magner. It is just a memo on the merits. His intent was crystal clear. Mr. Perez also testified that Mr. Brooker called him back the next day and refused to omit the discussion of Magner. Now let's applaud that civil servant, because he isn't going to play that game. And according to Mr. Perez, he told Mr. Brooker during this call to follow the normal process. But again, this story is just not supported by the evidence. 1 month later, after Mr. Perez flew to Minnesota to personally seal the deal with the city, a line attorney in the Civil Division emailed his superior to outline the quote-unquote additional facts about the deal. Point 6 read, quote, USAMN, and that stands for U.S. Attorney, Minnesota. So let me start over again. Quote, USAMN considers it, underlined, non-negotiable that its office will include the discussion of the Supreme Court case and the policy issues in the declination memo, end of quote. If Mr. Perez's story were true and the issue was resolved on January the 11th, then why, 1 month later, would the U.S. Attorney's Office need to emphatically state that it would not hide the fact that the exchange took place? Now, as I just mentioned, Mr. Perez flew to Minneapolis to finalize the deal on February the 3rd. And you would think, wouldn't you, that a deal of this magnitude would be written down so that the parties understood exactly what each side agreed to. But was this agreement written down? No, it wasn't. After Mr. Perez finalized the deal, the career attorneys asked if there was going to be a written agreement. What was Mr. Perez's response? He said, quote, "No, just oral discussions. Word was your bond," end of quote. So let me just review. At this point, Mr. Perez had just orchestrated a deal where the United States declined to join a case worth up to $200 million of taxpayers' money in exchange for the city of St. Paul withdrawing a case from the Supreme Court. And when the career lawyers asked if this deal will be written down, he said, quote, "No, your word was your bond," end of quote. Of course, the reason you make agreements like this in writing is so that there is no disagreement down the road about what the parties agreed to. And as it turns out, there was in fact a disagreement about the terms of this unwritten deal. The lawyer for the city, that's Mr. Lillehaug, told congressional investigators that on January 9th, approximately 1 month before the deal was finalized, Mr. Perez had assured him that, quote, HUD would be helpful, end of quote, if the Newell case proceeded after the Department of Justice declined to intervene. Mr. Lillehaug also told investigators that on February 4, the day after they finalized the deal, Mr. Perez told him that HUD had begun assembling information to assist the city in a motion to dismiss the Newell complaint on quote-unquote original source grounds. But according to Mr. Lillehaug, this assistance disappeared after the lawyers in the civil division learned of it. Now, why is that significant? Mr. Perez represents the United States. He represents the American people. Now, this Mr. Newell, the whistleblower, is bringing a case on behalf of the United States and indirectly the people. Mr. Perez is talking to the lawyers on the other side, and he tells the people, in essence, after the United States declines to join the case, we will give you information to help you defeat Mr. Newell, who is bringing the case on behalf of the United States. Let me say that a different way. In effect, Mr. Perez is offering to give the other side information to help defeat his own client. Now, is that the way you represent the American people? And you're working for the American people. Mr. Perez was asked about this under oath. Mr. Perez told congressional investigators, quote, "No, I don't recall ever suggesting that," end of quote. So on the one hand, we have Mr. Lillehaug, who says Mr. Perez made this offer first in January and then again on February 4, but the assistance disappeared after the lawyers in the civil division caught wind of it. On the other hand is Mr. Perez, who testified under oath, quote, "I don't recall," end of quote, ever making such an offer. Who should we believe? The documents support Mr. Lillehaug's version of the event. On February the 7th, a line attorney sent an email to the Director of Civil Fraud Section and relayed a conversation a line attorney in Minnesota had with Mr. Lillehaug. According to Mr. Lillehaug, the line attorney wrote, there were 2 additional items that were part of the deal. And one of those 2 items was this, quote, HUD will provide material to the city in support of their motion to dismiss the original source grounds, end of quote. Internal emails show that when the career lawyers learned of this promise, They strongly disagreed with it, and they conveyed their concern to Tony West, head of the Civil Division. During his transcribed interviews, Mr. West testified that it would have been, quote unquote, inappropriate to provide this material outside of the normal discovery channels. Mr. West said, quote, "I just know that that wasn't going to happen, and it didn't happen," end of quote. In other words, when the lawyers at the Civil Division learned of this offer, they shut it down. Again, why is this important? It is important because it demonstrates that the documentary evidence shows the events transpired exactly as Mr. Lillyhog said they did. Mr. Perez offered to provide the other side with information that would help them defeat Mr. Newell, in this case, on behalf of the United States. In my opinion, this is simply stunning. Mr. Perez represents the United States. Any lawyer would tell you it is highly inappropriate to offer to help the other side defeat their own client. This brings me to my final 2 points that I want to highlight for my colleagues. Even though the Department traded away Mr. Newell's case and $200 million, Mr. Perez has defended his actions in part by claiming that Mr. Newell still had his day in court. What Mr. Perez omits from his story is that Mr. Newell's case was dismissed precisely because the United States would not continue to be a party and would not be a party. After the United States declined to join the case, the judge dismissed Mr. Newell's case based upon, quote unquote, the public disclosure bar, finding that he was not the original source of information to the government. I'll remind my colleagues, we amended the False Claims Act several years ago precisely to prevent an outcome like this. Specifically, the amendments made clear that the Justice Department can contest the original source dismissal even if it fails to intervene, as it did in this case. So the Department didn't merely decline to intervene, which is bad enough, but in fact it affirmatively chose to leave Mr. Newell all alone in this case. And of course, that was the whole point. That is why it was so important for the city of St. Paul to make sure that the United States did not join the case. That is why the city was willing to trade away a strong case before the Supreme Court and cut the taxpayers out of $200. In the process, when this case doesn't go forward, you cut the taxpayers out of $200 million. The city knew that if the United States joined the action, the case would almost certainly not go forward. I said that wrong. I'm sorry. The city knew that if the United States joined the action, the case would almost certainly go forward. Conversely, the city knew that if the United States did not join the case and chose not to contest the original source, it would likely get dismissed. The Department traded away a case worth millions of taxpayers' dollars. They did it precisely because of the impact the decision would have on the litigation. They knew that as a result of their decision, the whole whistleblower would get dismissed based upon original source grounds since the Department didn't contest it. And not only that, Mr. Perez went so far as to offer to provide documents to the other side that would help them defeat Mr. Newell in his case on behalf of Mr. Perez's client, the United States. So now that's really looking out for the taxpayers. How would you like to have a lawyer like that defending you in some death penalty case? And yet when the Congress starts asking questions, they have the guts to say, quote, we didn't do anything improper about Mr. Newell. Or, quote, we didn't do anything improper because Mr. Newell still had his day in court. Well, Mr. Newell, end of quote. Mr. Newell didn't have his day in court because the success of that $200 million case was dependent upon the United States staying in it. Now, this brings me to my last point on the substance of this matter, and that has to do with the strength of the case. Throughout our investigation, the Department has tried to defend Mr. Perez's action by claiming that the case was marginal and weak. Once again, however, the documents tell a far different story. Before Mr. Perez got involved, the career lawyers at the Department wrote a memo recommending intervention in the case. In that memo, they described St. Paul's actions as, quote, a particularly egregious example of false certification, end of quote. In fact, the career lawyers in Minnesota felt so strongly about the case that they took the unusual step of flying to Washington, D.C. to meet with officials in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And Housing and Urban Development, of course, agreed that the United States should intervene in this false claims case. But of course, you know, that was all before Mr. Perez got involved. The documents make clear that career lawyers considered it a strong case, but the department has claimed that Mike Hertz, the department's expert on the False Claims Act, considered it a weak case. In fact, during his confirmation hearing, Mr. Perez testified before my colleagues on the Senate Help Committee that Mr. Hertz, quote, had a very immediate and visceral reaction that it was a weak case, end of quote. But once again, the documents tell a much different story than was told to members of the Senate. Mr. Hertz knew about the case in November 2011. 2 months later, a department official took notes of a meeting where the quid pro quo was discussed. The official wrote down Mr. Hertz's reaction. She wrote, quote, Mike, odd, looks like buying off St. Paul. Should be whether there are legit reasons to decline as to past practice, end of quote. The next day, the same official emailed the Associate Attorney General and said, quote, Mike Hertz brought up the St. Paul disparate impact case in which the Solicitor General just filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court. He's concerned about the recommendation that we decline to interview in 2 qui tam cases against St. Paul, end of quote. These documents appear to show that Mr. Hertz's primary concern was not the strength of the case, as Mr. Perez led my Senate colleagues to believe. Mr. Hertz was concerned the quid pro quo Mr. Perez ultimately arranged was improper. Again, in his words, it, quote, looks like buying off St. Paul, end quote. Yet Mr. Perez led my colleagues on the Help Committee to believe that Mr. Hertz believed it was a bad case on the merits. So let me make one final point regarding process and why it is premature to even be having this debate. As of today, when we vote on Mr. Perez's nomination, we will be voting on a nominee who to date has not complied with a congressional subpoena compelling him to turn over certain documents to Congress. I'm referring to the fact that the House Oversight and Governmental Reform Committee subpoenaed emails from Mr. Perez. During the course of our investigation, we learned that Mr. Perez was routinely using his private email account to conduct government business, including business related to the quid pro quo. In fact, the Department of Justice admitted that Mr. Perez had used his private email account approximately 1,200 times to conduct government business. After Mr. Perez refused to turn those documents over voluntarily, then the House Oversight Committee was forced to issue a subpoena. And yet today, Mr. Perez has refused to comply with the subpoena. Now here you got a person in the Justice Department doing all these bad things. People want him to be Secretary of Labor, and we're supposed to confirm somebody that won't respond to a subpoena for information that Congress is constitutionally entitled to. And we want him to be a Secretary of Labor when we have people come before Congress and say, yeah, we will respond to letters from Congress, we'll come up and testify, we're going to cooperate in the spirit of checks and balances. And then we got somebody before the Senate that won't even respond to a subpoena. So I find it quite troubling that this body would take this step and move forward with a nomination when the nominee simply refuses to comply with an outstanding subpoena. Can any of my colleagues recall an instance in the past when we were asked to confirm a nominee who would flatly refuse to comply with a congressional subpoena? Why would you want somebody in the cabinet thumbing their noses at the elected representatives of the people of this country that have the constitutional responsibility of checks and balances to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed? That's what they take an oath to do. It's quite extraordinary and should concern all of my colleagues, not just Republicans. My colleagues are well aware how I feel about the Whistleblower Protection Act. And my colleagues know how I feel about protecting whistleblowers who have courage to step forward, often at great risk to their careers. And this is about much more than whistleblowers, about the whistleblower who was left dangling by Mr. Perez. This is about the fact that Mr. Perez manipulated the rule of law in order to get a case removed from the Supreme Court docket. And this is about the fact that when Congress started asking questions about this case, and when Mr. Perez was called upon to offer his testimony under oath, he chose to tell a different story. And the unavoidable conclusion is that the story he told is not supported by the facts. And this is about the fact that we are about to confirm a nominee who, even as of today, is still thumbing his nose at Congress by refusing to comply with a congressional subpoena. I began by saying that although I disagree with Mr. Perez on a host of policy issues, that those disagreements are not the primary reason my colleagues should reject this nomination. We should reject this nomination because Mr. Perez manipulated the levers of power available to people in order to save a legal theory from Supreme Court review. Perhaps more importantly, when Mr. Perez was called upon to answer questions about his actions under oath, I do not believe he gave us a straight story. Finally, we should reject this nomination because Mr. Perez failed and refuses yet to comply with a congressional subpoena. For these reasons, I strongly oppose the nomination, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And, Mr. President, I am complete. I've completed my statement.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I have listened very carefully to my friend from Iowa, and I couldn't disagree with him more. I know he has very strong views about the nomination of Tom Perez, but let me go through the record. I want to spend a little bit of time talking first about Tom Perez. I know him very well. And before I start, Mr. President, I would ask, I have 13 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have been approved by the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I know Tom Perez. We have served together in government in Maryland. He served on the county council of Montgomery County. I mentioned that he's the first Latino to serve on the county council of Montgomery County. Montgomery County, which is very close to here, is larger than some of our states. It's a large government and has very complex problems. He served with great distinction on the county council, and as the presiding officer knows, that's a very difficult responsibility to serve for local government. You've got to deal with the day-to-day problems of the people of our community. He served with such distinction that he was selected to be the president of the council, the head of the council in Montgomery County. He then went on to become the Secretary of Labor and Licensing and Regulation under Governor O'Malley in the state of Maryland, very comparable to the position that President Obama has appointed him to as Secretary of Labor in his cabinet. It's very interesting. As Secretary of the Labor, Licensing and Regulation, he had to deal with issues that are very difficult issues that can divide groups. But instead, he brought labor and business together and resolved many issues. It's very interesting in his confirmation process, business leaders and labor leaders came forward to say this is the right person at the right time to serve as Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration. I held a press briefing with the former head of the Republican Party in Maryland, and he was very quick to point out that Tom Perez and him didn't agree on a lot of policy issues. But he's a professional, he listens, and tries to make the right judgment. And that's why he should be confirmed as Secretary of Labor. That was the former head of the Republican Party in Maryland who made those statements just a few months ago. Tom Perez has a long history of public service. He served originally in the Department of Justice in many different capacities. He started in the Department of Justice. He served in the Civil Rights Division and, of course, later became the head of the Civil Rights Division. He helped us in the United States Senate, serving as staff person for Senator Kennedy. And I think the greatest testimony of his effectiveness is how he's taken the Civil Rights Division from a division that had lost a lot of its glamour, a lot of its objectivity under the previous administration, and is returning the Department of Justice to that great institution to protect the rights of all Americans. Look at his record in the Department of Justice. Enforcement of the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. 141 defendants on hate crimes in the 4 years. That's a 74% increase. 194 human trafficking cases. That's a 40% increase. We could talk a good deal about what happened between 2004 and 2008 with Countrywide Financial Corporation, one of the nation's largest residential mortgage lenders, engaged in systematic discrimination against African American and Latino borrowers by steering them into subprime loans or requiring them to pay more for their mortgages. I know the pain that caused. I've met with families that should have been in traditional mortgages that were steered into subprime and they lost their homes. Tom Perez represented them in one of the largest recoveries ever. Division settlement in the 2011 required Bank of America, now the owner of Countrywide, to provide $335 million in monetary relief to more than 230 victims of discriminatory lending, the largest fair lending settlement in history. That's the record of Tom Perez as the head of the Civil Rights Division. The division investigated Wells Fargo Bank, the largest residential home mortgage lender in the United States, alleging that the bank engaged in a nationwide pattern of practice of discrimination against minority borrowers by placing, again, subprime loans. The division settlement, the largest per-victim recovery ever reached in a division lending discrimination case, required Wells Fargo to pay more than $184 million to compensate discrimination victims and to make a $50 million investment in home buyers assistance programs. And, Mr. President, I could go on and on and on about the record that Tom Perez has done in his public service, at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level. He has devoted his career to public service and has gotten the praise of conservatives and progressives, Democrats and liberals, business leaders, labor leaders. That's the person that we need to head the Department of Labor. So let me spend a few minutes talking about Senator Grassley's 2 points that he raises as to why we should deny the confirmation of Tom Perez, the President's choice for his cabinet. He talks about the fact that Tom Perez hasn't answered all the information that Senator Grassley would like to see from a House committee, a partisan effort in the House of Representatives. Not the only case. There's hardly a day or week that goes by there's not another partisan investigation in the House of Representatives. That's the matter that the senator from Iowa was talking about. Not an effort that we try to do in this body, in the Senate, to work bipartisan when we're doing investigations. This has been a partisan investigation. Thousands of pages of documents have been made available to congressional committees by the Department of Justice. So let's get the record straight as to compliance. The Department of Justice, Tom Perez, has complied with the reasonable requests of the Congress of the United States. Spent a lot of time doing that. That's our responsibility for oversight. And we've carried out our responsibility for oversight. And any balanced review of the work done by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division will give the highest marks to Tom Perez on restoring the integrity of that very important division in the Department of Justice. So let me talk about the second matter that Senator Grassley brings up. And that deals with the City of St. Paul case. One case dealt with the City of St. Paul in the Supreme Court Magner case. Now, Mr. President, Senator Grassley points out, and correctly so, that this is a desperate impact case. It not only affects the individual case that's before the court, it will have an impact on these types of cases generally. And when you're deciding whether to litigate one of these cases, you have to make a judgment as to whether this is the case you want to present to the court to make a point that will affect not only the justice of the litigants, but many other litigants. And you've got to decide the risk of litigation versus the benefit of litigation. And you've got to make some tough choices as to whether the risk is worth the benefit. And in this case, the decision was made not by Tom Perez, not by one person. Career attorneys were brought into the mix, and career attorneys advised against the Department of Justice interceding in this case. HUD lawyers thought that this was not a good case for the United States to intercede. Senator Grassley says, well, this was a situation where there was a quid pro quo. It was not. There was a request that the United States intercede and dismiss. Tom Perez said, no, we're not going to do that. The litigation went forward. So a professional decision was made based upon the best advice gotten by career attorneys, attorneys from the agency that was directly affected by the case that was before the courts. And a decision was made that most objective observers will tell you was a professional judgment that's hard to question. It made sense at the time. So I understand that Senator Grassley has a concern about this case. People can come to different conclusions. But look at the entire record of Tom Perez. I think he made the right decision in that case. But I know that he has a proud record of leadership on behalf of the rights of all Americans. And that's the type of person that we should have as Secretary of Labor. Tom Perez has been through confirmation before. He was confirmed by the Judiciary Committee to serve as the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Thorough vetting was done at that time. Questions were asked. Debate was held on the floor of the Senate. And by a very comfortable margin, he was confirmed to be the head of the Civil Rights Division. And now the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee has held a hearing on Tom Perez to be Secretary of Labor. They held a vote several months ago, reported him favorably to the floor. It's time for us to have an up or down vote on the President's nomination for Secretary of Labor. I would hope all my colleagues would vote to allow this nomination to be voted up or down. I was listening to my distinguished friend from Iowa. I heard nothing that would deny us the right to have a vote on a presidential nomination. And that's the first vote we're going to have, on whether we're going to filibuster a cabinet position for the President of the United States on a person whose record is distinguished, a long record of public service, and a proven record. Then the second vote is on confirmation, and senators may disagree. I respect every senator to do what he or she thinks is in the best interest. But I would certainly hope on this first vote, when we're dealing whether we're going to filibuster a president's nomination for Secretary of Labor, that we would get the overwhelming support of our colleagues to allow our up or down vote on Tom Perez to be the next Secretary of Labor. Mr. President, I started by saying that I've known Tom Perez for a long time, and I have. I know he is a good person, a person who is in public service for the right reasons, a person who believes that each individual should be protected under our system, and that as Secretary of Labor, he will use that position to bring the type of balance that we need in our commercial communities to protect working people and businesses so that the American economy can grow and everyone can benefit from our great economy. I would urge my colleagues to support this nomination and certainly to support moving forward on an up or down vote for the Secretary of Labor. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
The senator from Vermont.